February 24, 2022, when the Russian armed forces crossed into Ukraine, US President Joe Biden said, and I quote, "This was always about naked aggression, about Putin's desire for empire by any means necessary." We are now looking at year 3 of the Russia-Ukraine war. The widespread view in the West, particularly in the United States, is that Russia is and has always been an expansionist force, and its president Vladimir Putin is the embodiment of the ambition to build a new Russian empire. On the other hand, Putin says NATO took advantage of Russian weakness after the collapse of the Soviet Union to move in towards its east, in violation of promises made to Moscow by Western leaders. In February 1990, the then US Secretary of State James Baker had given his famous word, "Not 1 inch eastward," in his meeting with Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev. And it is that very promise that Putin and West seem to disagree upon. The Russia-Ukraine war has divided the world into two basic narratives. One calls the Russian bear a rabid paranoid monster. The other can be explained perfectly by historian and Professor Jeffrey Sachs. Did the Western assurance refer strictly to the German unification process, or was it a broader commitment not to enlarge the NATO alliance? Here's a deep dive into the Russian side of the story. The first round of NATO enlargement in the 1990s brought Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary into the alliance. Later rounds added the Baltic republics, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and other East European countries. Washington then tried to include Georgia and Ukraine in the NATO alliance, seemingly disregarding Russia's core security interests and the promises made. Tensions, however, skyrocketed in Russia in 2002 when the US unilaterally dumped a crucial treaty. Over time, Moscow's complaints and warnings grew in intensity. Former US President George W. Bush began to treat Georgia and Ukraine as valued US political and military allies. In 2008, Bush pressed NATO to admit Ukraine and Georgia as members. Moscow began to push back. Putin launched a full-fledged military offensive in Georgia. Upon victory, Russia established permanent control over 2 Georgian areas with secessionist tendencies. Cut to 2013 and 2014, and the Russians were fuming at NATO for blowing one red light after another. As per Russian officials, in late 2013 and early 2014, the United States and several European governments meddled to support the efforts of protesters to unseat Ukraine's generally pro-Russia president Viktor Yanukovych, some 2 years before his term was about to expire. Yanukovych had become Ukraine's president in 2010. Russian intelligence intercepted and leaked to the international media an alleged phone call between Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland and US Ambassador to Ukraine Jeffrey Sachs. In the call, the top-ranking US official and Washington's ambassador to Kyiv allegedly discussed their preferences for specific personnel in a post in the Yanukovych government. In late 2021, it became clear that Kremlin's restraint had run its course and Moscow began issuing demands for security guarantees. With respect to Ukraine, the demand was clear. NATO troops and weaponry should never be stationed on Ukrainian territory, and Kyiv would never be invited to join the alliance. Russia and its allies say that when the West failed to provide those guarantees, Putin launched his devastating full-scale war in Ukraine. Jeffrey Sachs simplifies it even further. He says putting US military bases anywhere and everywhere in the world is just not the way to peace. The NATO alliance has continuously blamed Russia, and the Western allies say that they are doing everything to prevent World War III. They say Moscow seeks to alter the system prevailing since the end of Cold War. But for Russia and its allies, it is NATO who repeatedly failed to respect Russia's core security interest, and that's what led to the crisis in Ukraine. Now, 3 years into the war, and after several narratives being floated by both the West and Russia and its allies, this is where we stand. Despite the US and its allies' continued ambitious efforts to support the Ukrainians, there really seems no signs of an endgame in this crisis.